So when you ask most people why they take a photo, they will probably answer something like, I wanted to capture this person or this pet or simply a special or beautiful moment. Now, I'm a self-portrait photographer, meaning I constantly photograph myself. You may ask why, and it's a good question to be honest, but truly the answer is not as simple as I just wanted to capture the moment or preserve a memory. Instead, I actually use the camera in quite an unusual, different way that may surprise you. So in today's video, I'm going to show you how I approach photography as art, and I will show you how you can do the same to create more meaningful photos that will really make people feel something. So let me ask you something. What is the difference between a fantastic photo and a blah photo? In many cases, it's simply that the amazing photograph has some kind of narrative that captures your attention. Or it simply has an incredible visual appeal, like for example the photo of a very strong graphic print or an architectural structure. In both of those cases, the photographer isn't simply, taking a snapshot of whatever is there in the moment. Instead, they're really taking a photo with intention. They're thinking about composition, storytelling, patterns, colors, or other stylistic elements. That, in turn, is what makes their photo so compelling and so interesting. I will share some practical tips for how you can do that in a moment, but first let me quickly tell you more about my personal approach. So I take artistic self-portraits. That means that long before I take the photo, I've already decided what's going to be in it and how I'm going to portray it. So I hardly ever spontaneously photograph what's there, but I actually basically compose my photo beforehand, either in my mind or using a mood board or sketches. And that's actually what I mean by approaching photography as art. I don't really see myself as a photographer, but more as the artist composing the picture. And the camera is essentially my tool, the way a painter uses a paintbrush. So now back to you. How can you do this in your photography to create more interesting pictures? You might think by now this sounds really theoretical, kind of boring, doesn't that take the fun out of it? Now maybe that kind of approach to photography is just not your thing, and then that's totally fine as well. But if you are interested in approaching photography as an art form and really using the camera as your artistic tool, then keep watching now, because I'm gonna tell you some practical tips for how you can do that. But just before I get to that, a little reminder, it would help me so much if you subscribe to my channel or like this video so I can keep making content for you. Okay, so back to the practical tips. Number one, this is kind of obvious, honestly, but I'm gonna tell you anyway. I highly recommend you learn how to use the manual mode of your camera, because if you stay in auto mode, you have quite limited creativity. You can't change the shutter speed or the aperture, and you can't do certain things like motion blur or blurry backgrounds and stuff. So really try and get familiar with how your camera works. I'm going to link you 2 blog posts in the description that will explain exactly how manual mode works and how to control the settings of your camera. Then my second tip for approaching photography as art is to start with the story, not the subject. So before you pick up the camera, start with not what looks cool, but rather what feels meaningful to you. Always keep in mind what emotion, what narrative do I want this image to convey. Then my next tip is to be quite strategic about the style of your image. So it helps to look at a lot of photos actually of other photographers and to really analyze them and kind of find out, do you like very contrasty images? Do you like very dreamy images? Do you like very intense colors or rather soft pastel colors? And you also want to be quite intentional about your composition, always keeping in mind what kind of composition will make your photo more artistic or more aesthetic. If you need help with composition and visual style, you can check out my other video on this topic. I'm going to link that in the description below. Before I get to my next tip, by the way, you can download my free ebook. I have 2 actually. One is for self-portraits, one for portraits, and they contain 50 creative ideas, so make sure to download that, also in the description. Now back to the video. Okay, my next tip for artistic photography is it's one of my favorites actually, is to use light as a stylistic tool. So often when we take regular pictures, we just take out the camera and photograph in whatever light is available. But actually, using light in an intentional, strategic way can really transform your images and give them a very, very artistic look. For example, if you have very hard, harsh lighting, that will give you a super dramatic effect, whereas soft, minimal lighting can give your photo a more feminine or intimate vibe. Or another example, you can use intentional shadows to create mystery or tension in your images, particularly if you're going into more cinematic photography. Then the next tip, also make sure to think about colors, kind of actually like an artist would. So warm tones create energy, warmth, passion, intimacy. Then cool tones, on the other hand, they can give you a more calm, isolated, melancholic, serene look. And then, for example, if you're staying in black and white, so if you're going intentionally monochrome, your photos might look more timeless, more serious maybe, perhaps also more nostalgic. So I'm not saying one of those is better than the other. I'm just saying really be strategic about it and, think about it before you take the picture. Which effect do you want? If you're not really familiar with this, it can really help to study film color grading, because in the cinema, they do this intentionally as well to create a certain mood. I've also actually written a very in-depth blog post on color grading for photography. I'm also going to link that below. Then my next tip for more artistic photography is to embrace imperfections, because photos, by nature, they depict things very realistically. And so to make it look a bit more artistic, you can go for motion blur, you can use film, which often produces sort of happy accidents that are often very imperfect, but therefore really beautiful. So essentially you're trying to make mistakes on purpose, or mistakes, to make your photos more interesting and less realistic. So yeah, just keep in mind that photography as an art form is not meant to be polished, or it doesn't have to be polished. Sometimes it's raw and imperfect, and actually that can make it way more beautiful. And then my last tip is to be driven by a concept. This sounds very grand, but it really doesn't have to be this complicated concept. Just start with some kind of idea or a theme. For example, it could be as simple as what does solitude look like in the city? And then go out with that narrative in mind. And then, for example, if you're doing street photography, that will kind of kickstart your brain into looking for that concept or that theme everywhere. And you will notice, I think, that your photos will have more depth and just be more interesting and more artistic overall. I would love to know which of those tips resonated most with you and your style of photography. Leave me a comment, make sure to subscribe, and see you next time. Bye!